I do solemnly swear.
April 30th, 1789. At the age of 57, George Washington takes the oath of office to become the first president of the United States of America. He represented unity. He represented the entire nation. The selection of George Washington was a natural one. Historian James Shenton.
In a world of towering peaks, and that I think is how you have to look at these founding fathers, there was no peak that towered more omnipresently than Washington.
Born in Virginia, as a young man he was a surveyor, a horseman, and a military officer. Early on, Washington displayed leadership qualities. In 1755, when British General Braddock was killed during the French and Indian War, Washington led the survivors to safety. Years later, Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army.
I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with.
It was to be a long and difficult struggle for the Army and for Washington personally. His troops were untrained and undisciplined, and early on they lost many battles. After several defeats and retreats, General Washington precariously held on, barely keeping his troops together. At times, many times, the troops would panic, break rank, and run.
Good God! Are these the men with whom I am to defend America?
But on Christmas night, 1776, he crossed the Delaware River. All night long, men and horses ferried across. At Trenton, the enemy, stunned, fell in only 1 hour. Washington would carry on with new respect from his troops. The following winter at Valley Forge brought new hardships. Bitter cold, lack of food, fear. But two sources of help arrived that winter. The French threw their support behind the revolutionaries and sent much-needed supplies. And Baron von Steuben arrived. He was a German officer who had trained under Frederick the Great. He whipped the American troops into shape, and when spring came, they were prepared to fight. The fighting resumed, and though more American cities still fell, the tide was turning. On October 19, 1781, Lord Cornwallis's troops finally surrendered to Washington at Yorktown, Virginia. The war was effectively over. 2 years later, Washington rode triumphantly into New York to bid his troops an emotional farewell.
With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your later days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and humble. I can't come to each of you, but I should be obliged if each of you will come and take me by the hand.
But handshakes were not enough. The general put his arms around the men and openly wept. They all did. Christmas Eve, 1783, he was reunited with his wife Martha and her 2 children at Mount Vernon, which by now had grown to a series of 5 farms and 4,000 acres of tobacco, wheat, and corn. Slavery had become essential to the agricultural economy of the South, but by this time, the North had banned the importation of slaves. 4 years later, Washington was once again called to serve his country. The Articles of Confederation were not working, and so when Washington arrived in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, he was elected chairman and used his influence to help create a strong federal government. Washington biographer James Flexner.
And he came out of the Revolution as the great American hero. And there was no one else at that time who had at all the popular support that he did. It was said by people like Madison that the only reason that the Constitution was ratified was because Washington was in favor of it. The public absolutely, completely trusted him.
The new nation needed a president. There was only one logical choice. There was no campaign for Washington. He was elected unanimously by representatives of the states. He received word of his election at his beloved Mount Vernon home and began an 8-day triumphal ride to his inauguration, passing under lavish arches in grand style.
When George Washington became president, he was very self-conscious of the fact that he was the first president in the history of the world. Think about that.
What to call the new president was one of the first issues of his term. His Highness? His High and Mightiness? Finally, it was decided he would be Mr. President. From this point on, everything he did set a precedent.
But it is instructive that George Washington didn't shake hands while he was president. He always greeted guests standing on a little pedestal, almost invariably wearing a dressed sword.
The honor and dignity of the office was set by Washington. But within his cabinet, there was conflict, disputes over the unending question about the power of government. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton hotly advocated a strong central government. Secretary of State Jefferson took the opposite side. He wanted power spread among the states. As a mediator, Washington was masterful, keeping both Jefferson and Hamilton together in the cabinet. And though his power was increasing, he respected the Constitution.
He was a strong believer in the separation of powers. He never interfered when he was president with Congress. He didn't negotiate. He didn't do anything. His theory was that as president, it was his duty to administer.
By 1790, the first census had been counted. The new nation had grown to almost 4 million people. 700,000 of those were slaves. There were also 60,000 free blacks. The first term of Washington was an era of firsts. The president signed a bill creating the United States Bank. The New York Stock Exchange was established. The cotton gin was invented in 1793. It mechanized the production of cotton, which drove the Southern economy. With tension in his own cabinet and Europe in turmoil, Washington agreed to serve a second term as president. In 1794 came the most serious test of the federal government's ability to enforce laws. Farmers in western Pennsylvania and throughout Appalachia rebelled, refusing to pay an excise tax on whiskey. It was known as the Whiskey Rebellion. After 2 firm warnings, Washington used force to disperse the angry farmers. By the end of his second term, Washington was ready to retire. Mount Vernon had been ignored during his years in government. He returned there to live out his years as a gentleman farmer. On a rainy December day, Washington fell ill after riding the fields. There was no remedy. He died on December 14th, 1799. Stories about Washington have been passed down over the years. Some true, some myth.
Well, the whole business. I mean, his not smiling, his bad false teeth, the fact that he was supposed to be cold and distant, the fact that the belief that he was an English aristocrat who wanted to be king, and all the rest of it is all just pure poppycock. But it's what's in most people's mind, to say nothing of the dear old cherry tree.
But some things said of the first president still have the ring of truth. After his death, Congress adopted a resolution. It said Washington was a citizen, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen.